If you walked into any Toyota dealership in the world right now and asked the salesperson to show you the most exclusive, the most expensive, the most prestigious car Toyota makes, they would probably point you toward a Lexus, maybe an LC500 or an LS. And that would be wrong, because the most exclusive Toyota is not a Lexus. It's not even sold at Lexus dealers. And in most countries, you literally cannot buy one at all. It doesn't wear a Toyota badge. It doesn't have a flashy grille. It doesn't scream at you from across the parking lot. Instead, it wears a hand-carved phoenix emblem that takes nearly a month and a half to engrave under a microscope to tolerances of 1/100th of a millimeter. And its entire design philosophy can be summed up in one line. It stands out because it doesn't stand out. This is the Toyota Century, and it might be the most fascinating car most people have never heard of. To understand why this car exists at all, you need to go back to 1967. Toyota had been building luxury sedans with the Crown line. But by the mid-60s, the company wanted something different. Something that could stand next to a Rolls-Royce and not apologize. The rival Nissan President had launched in 1965, and it leaned heavily on the American styling. Big chrome, heavy presence, very "look at me." Toyota went the opposite direction. They chose to build a car rooted in traditional Japanese aesthetics. Restraint, quiet craftsmanship, dignity, and they named it the Century. Not because it was supposed to last 100 years, although honestly that's kind of what ended up happening, but because 1967 was the 100th anniversary of the birth of Sakichi Toyoda, the founder of Toyota Industries. Toyota's own heritage site says that every part of the Century was designed from scratch and emphasized traditional Japanese taste. That phrase, traditional Japanese taste, is important because it defines everything this car would become for the next 6 decades. The first generation ran from 1967 all the way to 1997. 30 years, on essentially the same platform, with a V8 engine that grew from 3 liters to eventually 4. The design barely changed, and normally when you say a car went 3 decades without a major redesign, that sounds like corporate laziness. But with the Century, it became part of the identity. This car was not supposed to look new. It was supposed to look correct, like a well-tailored suit that never goes out of style because it was never trying to be in style. During the bubble economy of the late 80s, sales nearly doubled, going from around 1,027 cars in 1985 to 2,117 in 1989. Because suddenly Japan had a lot more people who qualified for that kind of quiet success. But the real magic happened in 1997 with the second generation. Because Toyota did something genuinely insane. They built a V12. The 1GZFE, a 5-liter, 60-degree, 48-valve V12. It remains to this day the only V12 engine Toyota has ever produced, and the only V12 ever fitted to a Japanese production passenger car. Not for a sports car, not for some exotic supercar project, for a limousine that spends most of its life idling at curbs or crawling through Tokyo traffic. That is either the most absurd or the most incredible engineering flex in automotive history. And honestly, it might be both. And here's where it gets even better. The official power output was listed at 276 horsepower, which for a V12 sounds kind of embarrassing. But that number was not a limitation of the engine. It was a limitation of politics. Japanese automakers had a gentleman's agreement that capped advertised power at 276 horsepower for the domestic market. The roughly 100 export cars were rated at 295. And independent estimates put the real output around 8 to 312 horsepower. Toyota built a V12 that was more powerful than they were even allowed to tell you about. And they put it in a car designed for the back seat. That engine was also engineered as essentially two inline sixes on a common crankshaft, with separate ECUs for each bank, meaning if one half failed, the car could still run on 6 cylinders. Because if you're the kind of person who rides in a century, being stranded on the side of the road is simply not an option. And the way the car was built makes the engineering look almost straightforward by comparison. The Century was not assembled on a normal production line. Toyota's own newsroom describes the process as having no assembly line, no long row of cars. Just a quiet space where a small number of highly trained craftspeople create cars almost as if they are producing works of art. 4 people spend 3 days building a single vehicle. The signature color, called Kamui Eternal Black, uses 7 coats of paint versus 4 for a standard Toyota. Between coats, the body is wet sanded under running water 3 times, then mirror polished. The factory workers actually visit traditional lacquerware workshops in Ishikawa to study centuries-old urushi black lacquer techniques. For car paint. Let that sink in. The doors are deliberately set slightly misaligned during assembly, because once all the heavy interior trim goes in, the weight pulls them into perfect alignment. If you build them straight, they end up slightly off once loaded. And someone at Toyota decided that the mechanical click of a door latch sounded too crude, so the doors open electrically and soft close themselves. This is a car where even the sound of a door opening was considered a design flaw. If you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into cars that most people never talk about, subscribing would mean a lot, because this is exactly the kind of stuff we love covering. Now, who actually buys a Century? The official answer is the Emperor of Japan, the Prime Minister, senior government officials, and corporate chairman. Toyota's own marketing described it as the car acquired through persistent work, the kind done in a plain but formal suit. The rear seat is where this car lives. The upholstery is wool, not leather, which sounds like a downgrade until you realize leather creaks every time you shift in your seat. Wool doesn't. Leather gets scorching in summer and freezing in winter. Wool breathes. The seats use coil springs instead of foam. The windows have white lace curtains, not tinted glass, because tinted glass was considered to attract unwarranted attention. A curtain is more dignified, and reviewers describe the interior as near anechoic silence. This is a car where you hear nothing except whatever you choose to hear. But then there's the other buyer, the one Toyota absolutely never puts in the brochure. The black, curtained, badge-free Century became iconic in Yakuza culture. It turns out that when you design a car to be invisible, powerful and discreet, organized crime bosses find it very attractive. You really can't blame Toyota for that. They built a car that whispers, and it turns out a lot of different kinds of powerful people prefer whispering to shouting. The most extreme version ever built was the Century Royal, the Imperial State car. Each one cost approximately 52.5 million yen, around $500,000. Toyota built only 4. They wear the 16-petal gold chrysanthemum, the imperial seal of Japan. When the emperor rides, the imperial standard replaces the license plate. For Emperor Naruhito's enthronement parade in November 2019, Toyota built a one-off open-top Century with the rear seats raised 4 centimeters and fixed at exactly 25 degrees. They built this to replace a 1990 Rolls-Royce. Because even for the most ceremonial moment in Japanese public life, Toyota decided their own car was the right choice. The Century was never officially exported in any meaningful way. In the United States, you can only import one through the 25-year rule, and clean V12 examples typically sell for $25,000 to $40,000, which, when you think about it, is kind of absurd. You can buy the only V12 Toyota ever made, a hand-built car with 7 coats of paint and a phoenix carved under a microscope, for less than a loaded Camry. But this story might be changing. In October 2025, Akio Toyoda announced that Century would become a standalone ultra-luxury brand positioned above Lexus. Toyota said, "When we go higher end, we need something above. Not Lexus, nor Toyota. And we have the Century. For the first time in 58 years, this car that was defiantly, stubbornly, almost arrogantly Japan only, is going global. And maybe that changes everything. Or maybe it changes nothing. Because the Century was never really about being sold everywhere. It was about being built a certain way for a certain kind of person. A car where 4 craftspeople spend 3 days. Where paint is treated like lacquerware. Where the doors are engineered to sound like nothing at all. Where the most powerful engine Toyota ever built was deliberately underrated because discretion mattered more than bragging rights. In a world full of cars fighting for your attention, with massive grilles and aggressive styling and fake exhaust tips, the Toyota Century spent nearly 60 years proving that the most powerful statement you can make is saying absolutely nothing at all.